At the center of this impending tempest stood the Jackson residence, a tasteful two-story home with a meticulously manicured lawn and a white picket fence that seemed to proclaim its inhabitants' adherence to wholesome family values. Inside, Gabrielle Jackson hummed softly to herself as she prepared dinner, blissfully unaware that her world was about to come crashing down around her. Gabrielle, a successful real estate agent with a warm smile and an easy laugh, had always prided herself on her ability to read people. It was a skill that had served her well in both her personal and professional life. But as she stood in her kitchen, chopping vegetables for a salad, she couldn't have imagined the betrayal that was unfolding just a stone's throw away. Across the street, in the modest bungalow that had recently been rented by the Williams family, 15-year-old Tiana Williams sat at her bedroom window, her dark eyes fixed on the Jackson house. Her gaze held a mixture of guilt, excitement, and fear, emotions far too complex for someone her age to fully comprehend or control. As night fell over the San Fernando Valley, Gabrielle Jackson put the finishing touches on dinner, completely oblivious to the fact that her life was about to change forever. And across the street, Tiana Williams made a decision that would set in motion a series of events from which there would be no turning back. Gabrielle Jackson's world shattered on a Tuesday evening in August, as the relentless California sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The day had started like any other, a blur of client meetings, property viewings, and the usual juggling act of balancing her thriving career with the demands of family life. But as she stood in her immaculate kitchen, putting the finishing touches on a meal that would never be eaten, she had no idea that her life was about to implode. The first inkling that something was amiss came when she realized her husband, Devin, was late for dinner. This wasn't entirely unusual. His job as a high school basketball coach often kept him working long hours. But tonight was supposed to be different. It was their anniversary, and Devin had promised to be home early to celebrate. Gabrielle's perfectly manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm on the granite countertop as she glanced at the clock for what felt like the 100th time. The roast chicken she'd prepared, Devin's favorite, was growing cold, and the candles she'd lit were burning low, their flickering flames a silent mockery of her romantic intentions. With a sigh of frustration, she reached for her phone, intending to call her husband. But before her fingers could dial the familiar number, a notification caught her eye. It was a message from her neighbor, Letitia, who lived 2 doors down. "Hey girl, just saw Devin's car parked outside Williams, thought you should know." Gabrielle frowned, her brow furrowing in confusion. The Williams family had moved into the neighborhood just a few months ago, a single mother and her teenage daughter. They seemed nice enough, but Gabrielle couldn't fathom why Devin would be at their house, especially tonight of all nights. A knot of unease began to form in the pit of her stomach as she slipped on her shoes and headed out the front door. The warm evening air enveloped her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden doing little to calm her growing anxiety. As she approached the Williams residence, Gabrielle could see Devin's car parked haphazardly at the curb, as if he'd been in a hurry. The house itself was dark, save for a faint glow emanating from an upstairs window. The curtains were drawn, but not completely closed, leaving a tantalizing gap that seemed to beckon her closer. Her heart pounding, Gabrielle crept up to the side of the house, her eyes fixed on that sliver of light. She told herself she was being ridiculous, that there had to be a perfectly innocent explanation for Devin's presence here. Maybe he was helping Mrs. Williams with some household repair, or perhaps he was mentoring her daughter, who she vaguely recalled was on the school's track team. But as she drew nearer to the window, the muffled sounds that reached her ears shattered any hope of innocence. She heard giggles, whispers, and then, unmistakably, the low, husky laugh that she knew belonged to her husband. With trembling hands, Gabrielle reached up and parted the bushes beneath the window, creating a small opening through which she could peer inside. What she saw in that moment would be forever seared into her memory, a tableau of betrayal that would haunt her dreams for years to come. There, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp, was Devin, her husband of 15 years, the father of her children. locked in a passionate embrace with Tiana Williams. The girl couldn't have been more than 15, her youthful features a stark contrast to Devon's mature physique. They were tangled together on the bed, clothes discarded on the floor, lost in a moment of illicit passion. Gabrielle's world tilted on its axis, the ground seeming to shift beneath her feet. She stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that threatened to tear from her throat. Bile rose in her throat as the full impact of what she'd witnessed hit her like a physical blow. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. How long had this been going on? How could Devon, the man she thought she knew better than anyone in the world, betray her like this? And with a child, no less. The thought made her physically ill. As she staggered back towards her own house, Gabrielle's shock began to give way to a white-hot rage that coursed through her veins like molten lava. The carefully constructed life she'd built, the perfect marriage, the respected position in the community, it had all been a lie. And in that moment, as the last rays of sunlight disappeared from the sky, something inside Gabrielle Jackson broke irreparably. She entered her home, the romantic dinner she'd prepared now a cruel joke. The candles had burned out, plunging the dining room into darkness, a fitting metaphor for the death of her marriage. As she stood in the shadows, her mind began to formulate a plan. This betrayal would not go unpunished. Devon had destroyed their family, and now Gabrielle would destroy him. Little did she know, the path of vengeance she was about to embark upon would have consequences far beyond anything she could have imagined. As the night deepened, Gabrielle Jackson made a decision that would set in motion a chain of events that would rock the foundations of Oakwood and leave no one untouched by its devastating aftermath. The following days passed in a blur for Gabrielle Jackson. She moved through her daily routines like a ghost, her mind constantly replaying the horrific scene she'd witnessed. The betrayal ate at her, corroding her from the inside out, transforming the warm, vivacious woman she'd once been into a hollow shell consumed by rage and pain. Devon, oblivious to his wife's discovery, continued his charade of normalcy. He came home late from practice, kissed Gabrielle on the cheek, and asked about her day as if nothing had changed. Each lie that fell from his lips only stoked the fires of Gabrielle's fury. She watched him with new eyes now, noting every inconsistency, every half-truth. The way he checked his phone more frequently, the secretive smiles that played across his lips when he thought no one was looking. It all made sense now, and Gabrielle cursed herself for not seeing it sooner. As the days wore on, Gabrielle's pain began to crystallize into something harder, colder. She started to plan, meticulously gathering evidence of Devon's infidelity. She installed a tracking app on his phone, recorded his conversations, and even hired a private investigator to document his comings and goings. But it wasn't enough. The thought of Devon with Tiana, sweet, innocent Tiana, who was barely older than their own daughter, made Gabrielle's blood boil. This wasn't just an affair. It was a violation of trust on the deepest level. Devon wasn't just cheating on her. He was preying on a child. 1 week after her discovery, Gabrielle found herself sitting in her car outside Tiana's school, watching as the students streamed out at the end of the day. She spotted Tiana easily, the girl's vibrant energy setting her apart from her peers. Gabrielle's heart clenched as she observed the teenager laughing with her friends, seemingly without a care in the world. For a moment, Gabrielle's resolve wavered. Tiana was just a child after all. Could she really be held responsible for Devon's actions? But then she remembered the scene in the bedroom, the way Tiana had clung to Devon, the look of desire in her young eyes, and her sympathy evaporated. As Tiana separated from her friends and began walking home, Gabrielle made a split-second decision. She started her car and pulled up alongside the girl, rolling down her window. "Tiana, it's Mrs. Jackson, Devon's wife. Can we talk for a moment?" The color drained from Tiana's face as she recognized Gabrielle. For a second, it looked like she might bolt, but then she nodded hesitantly and climbed into the car. The conversation that followed was tense, filled with long silences and half-truths. Tiana, clearly uncomfortable, tried to maintain her innocence, but Gabrielle could see the guilt written all over her face. "I know what's been going on between you and my husband," Gabrielle said finally, her voice cold and hard. "It needs to stop. Now. Tiana's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen. Coach Jackson, Devin, he said he loved me, that we were meant to be together." Gabrielle's hands tightened on the steering wheel, her knuckles turning white. "He's using you, Tiana. You're just a child. What he's doing is illegal, not to mention morally reprehensible." "You don't understand," Tiana protested weakly. "It's not like that. We love each other." "Love?" Gabrielle laughed bitterly. "You don't know the first thing about love. What you're feeling is infatuation, manipulation. Devin is a predator, and you're his prey." The harsh words hung in the air between them, and Gabrielle could see the moment they hit home. Tiana's face crumpled, and she began to sob in earnest. For a brief moment, Gabrielle felt a flicker of compassion for the girl, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her own pain, her own shattered dreams. "This ends now," Gabrielle said firmly. "If I find out that you've had any further contact with my husband, I will go to the police. Do you understand?" Tiana nodded miserably, her whole body shaking with suppressed sobs. As Gabrielle dropped Tiana off at her house, she felt a grim satisfaction. One loose end tied up. But she knew it wasn't enough. Devin was the real problem, and he needed to pay for what he'd done. That night, as Devin slept soundly beside her, the sleep of the seemingly innocent, Gabrielle lay awake, her mind racing. She thought about the life they'd built together, the memories they'd shared. She thought about their children, about the community that looked up to them as role models. And then she thought about how Devin had thrown it all away for a schoolgirl fantasy. How he'd made a mockery of their marriage vows, how he'd betrayed not just her, but their entire family. In that moment, as the moonlight filtered through the curtains and cast eerie shadows across the bedroom, Gabrielle made her decision. Devin Jackson needed to be destroyed, completely and utterly. And she would be the one to do it. As she finally drifted off to sleep, a small, cold smile played across Gabrielle's lips. The unraveling of Devin Jackson's life was about to begin, and she would make sure that when it was over, he would have nothing left. The first phase of her plan involved gathering irrefutable evidence of Devin's relationship with Tiana. Despite her warning, Gabrielle had continued to monitor their interactions, and she knew the affair was ongoing. Using the skills she'd honed as a real estate agent, she managed to plant hidden cameras in strategic locations around the Williams house. The footage she captured was damning. Devin and Tiana in various states of undress, engaged in acts that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. The second phase focused on Devin's financial improprieties. Gabrielle had discovered that her husband had been embezzling funds from L's athletic department for years. She meticulously documented every transaction, building a case that would be impossible to defend against. The final phase of her plan was perhaps the most cruel, but in Gabrielle's mind, the most necessary. She began to subtly poison their children against their father, dropping hints about his infidelity and questionable character. It was a slow process, but she could see the seeds of doubt taking root in their young minds. As Halloween approached, Gabrielle felt a sense of grim anticipation. She had chosen this date, a night of masks and deception, to set her plan in motion. The annual Oakwood Halloween Festival would provide the perfect backdrop for Devin's very public downfall. On the morning of October 31st, Gabrielle woke early, her body thrumming with nervous energy. She went about her day as usual, but there was a new lightness to her step, a glint in her eye that hadn't been there for months. That evening, as the sun began to set and the streets of Oakwood filled with costumed revelers, Gabrielle put the final touches on her own costume, a striking Cleopatra ensemble that accentuated her curves and commanded attention. Devin, dressed as Mark Antony in a matching costume he'd agreed to wear without suspicion, waited for her downstairs. "You look amazing," he said as she descended the stairs, his eyes roving appreciatively over her figure. Gabrielle smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thank you, darling. Shall we go?" As they drove to the festival, Gabrielle's mind raced through the steps of her plan one last time. Everything was in place. All that remained was to set it in motion. The Oakwood Halloween Festival was in full swing when they arrived. Children darted between booths, their laughter mixing with the strains of spooky music that filled the air. Parents chatted in groups, sipping hot cider and admiring each other's costumes. Gabrielle played her part to perfection, laughing at jokes, complimenting costumes, and keeping a possessive hand on Devon's arm. To anyone watching, they would have appeared to be the perfect couple. Successful, attractive, and deeply in love. As the evening wore on, Gabrielle kept a watchful eye on her watch. At precisely 9:30 p.m., she excused herself from a conversation with some neighbors and made her way to the stage where the costume contest winners were to be announced. Taking a deep breath, she ascended the steps and approached the microphone. The crowd fell silent, curious about this unscheduled interruption. "Good evening, Oakwood," Gabrielle began, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I hope you're all having a wonderful time tonight. I have an important announcement to make." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked onto Devon's confused face. "For years, we've all looked up to Devon Jackson as a pillar of our community, a dedicated coach, a loving father, a faithful husband." Her voice hardened. "But the man you think you know is a lie." A murmur ran through the crowd. Devon started to move towards the stage, but Gabrielle held up a hand, stopping him in his tracks. "Devon Jackson is a predator," she continued, her voice ringing out clearly in the stunned silence. "For months, he has been carrying on an affair with a 15-year-old student. I have proof." With that, she nodded to a friend in the sound booth, and suddenly the large screen behind her came to life. The crowd gasped as images of Devon and Tiana flashed across the screen, leaving no doubt as to the nature of their relationship. "But that's not all," Gabrielle pressed on, her voice growing stronger with each word. "He has been stealing from our children, embezzling funds from the school's athletic department to finance his lavish lifestyle and secret rendezvous." She produced a stack of documents from beneath her cloak and held them aloft. "I have all the evidence right here. The police have been notified, and they're on their way." As if on cue, the wail of police sirens cut through the night air. Gabrielle watched with grim satisfaction as two police cruisers pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the scene in alternating flashes of red and blue. In that moment, as Devon was handcuffed and led away, his pleas for mercy falling on deaf ears, Gabrielle felt a surge of triumph. She had done it. She had brought down the man who had betrayed her so completely. But as she stood there on the stage, watching her carefully constructed life crumble around her, Gabrielle failed to notice the figure slipping away from the edge of the crowd. Tiana Williams, her face a mask of anguish and guilt, disappeared into the shadows of the night. The storm had broken, and in its wake, nothing would ever be the same again. But for Gabrielle Jackson, this was just the beginning. She had set events in motion that would have far-reaching consequences, not just for her family, but for the entire community of Oakwood. The days following the Halloween festival unfolded like a surreal nightmare for the residents of Oakwood. The quiet suburb, once a bastion of middle-class respectability, found itself thrust into the harsh glare of the national spotlight. News vans clogged the streets, reporters prowled the neighborhood like vultures, hungry for any morsel of gossip or scandal. For Gabrielle Jackson, the aftermath of her very public revenge was a mixed bag of emotions. On one hand, she felt a grim satisfaction in seeing Devon's carefully crafted image crumble. He had been denied bail, deemed a flight risk, and a danger to the community. The evidence against him was overwhelming, thanks to Gabrielle's meticulous planning. But as the dust began to settle, Gabrielle found herself grappling with unexpected consequences. Her children, despite her attempts to shield them, were devastated. Their father, the man they had idolized, was now branded a monster. They withdrew from her, their eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and accusation. As for Tiana Williams, she had become a ghost. The day after the festival, she and her mother had packed up and left town in the dead of night, leaving behind a house full of half-packed boxes and unanswered questions. Gabrielle tried to go about her daily life, but everywhere she went, she felt the weight of stares and whispers. Her real estate business suffered as clients, uncomfortable with her notoriety, took their business elsewhere. The life she had fought so hard to protect was slipping through her fingers. One crisp November morning, about 2 weeks after the festival, Gabrielle sat at her kitchen table, nursing a cup of cold coffee and staring blankly at the stack of bills before her. The house was quiet. The children were at school, though their attendance had become sporadic as they struggled to cope with the taunts and stares of their classmates. The sharp trill of the doorbell startled her out of her reverie. She wasn't expecting anyone, and these days, unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. With a sigh, she rose and made her way to the front door. Standing on her porch was a woman she didn't recognize. Tall, with sharp features and keen eyes that seemed to look right through Gabrielle. "Mrs. Jackson?" the woman asked, her voice crisp and professional. "I'm Detective Amara Okafor. I was hoping we could talk." Gabrielle felt a chill run down her spine, but she nodded and stepped aside to let the detective in. As they settled in the living room, Gabrielle couldn't help but notice how out of place Detective Okafor looked among the cheerful family photos and tasteful decor. A stark reminder of how much had changed. "Mrs. Jackson," Detective Okafor began, her dark eyes never leaving Gabrielle's face, "I'm here to discuss some discrepancies in the case against your husband." Gabrielle's heart began to race, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Discrepancies? I'm not sure I understand. The evidence is quite clear, isn't it?" The detective's lips thinned into a grim line. "That's just it, Mrs. Jackson. The evidence is a little too clear. We've been doing some digging, and we've uncovered some irregularities that suggest the possibility of, shall we say, orchestration?" Gabrielle felt the blood drain from her face. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. "Let me be frank, Mrs. Jackson," Detective Okafor continued, her voice taking on a harder edge. "We have reason to believe that you may have manipulated evidence to incriminate your husband. The financial records, for instance. Our forensic accountants have found signs of recent alterations." That's ridiculous," Gabrielle stammered, her mind racing. She had been so careful, so meticulous in her planning. How could they have found anything? "Is it?" The detective raised an eyebrow. "We've also been unable to locate Tiana Williams or her mother. Their sudden disappearance is convenient, to say the least." Gabrielle's hands began to shake. She clasped them tightly in her lap, trying to maintain her composure. "I had nothing to do with their leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Detective Okafor leaned forward, her eyes boring into Gabrielle's. "Mrs. Jackson, I want you to understand the gravity of the situation. If we find evidence of tampering or false accusation, you could be facing serious charges: obstruction of justice, defamation, possibly even blackmail." The room seemed to spin around Gabrielle. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Devon was the criminal, the betrayer. She was the victim. How had the tables turned so quickly? I need to speak with my lawyer," Gabrielle managed to say, her voice sounding distant and strange to her own ears. Detective Okafor nodded, rising to her feet. "That would be wise. We'll be in touch, Mrs. Jackson. I suggest you don't leave town." As the detective saw herself out, Gabrielle remained frozen on the couch, her mind a whirlwind of panic and disbelief. The carefully constructed plan that was supposed to be her salvation now threatened to become her downfall. The detective started her car and pulled away from the curb, leaving Gabrielle alone with the weight of her actions and the growing realization that her quest for revenge might cost her everything she had left. As November gave way to December, the once pristine facade of Oakwood continued to crumble. The scandal surrounding the Jackson family had opened a Pandora's box of secrets and lies, and the quiet suburb found itself in the grip of a moral panic. For Gabrielle Jackson, the weeks following Detective Okafor's visit were a blur of legal consultations, sleepless nights, and increasingly hostile encounters with her neighbors. Her children, unable to bear the scrutiny and whispers at school, had been sent to stay with their grandparents in another state. The house, once filled with the sounds of family life, now echoed with an oppressive silence. As Christmas approached, bringing with it a dusting of snow that seemed to mock the idea of a white Christmas in sunny California, Gabrielle found herself sitting alone in her kitchen, staring at the phone. She had been putting off making this call for days, but she knew she couldn't delay any longer. With trembling fingers, she dialed a number she had memorized but never used. After 3 rings, a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Gabrielle took a deep breath. "Tiana? It's Gabrielle Jackson." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, filled with the static of miles and unspoken words. Mrs. Jackson, Tiana's voice was barely above a whisper. I don't think I should be talking to you. Please, Gabrielle said, hating the note of desperation in her voice. I need your help. Things have gotten out of control. Another pause, shorter this time. What do you mean? Gabrielle closed her eyes, steeling herself. The police, they're investigating me now. They think I might have manipulated evidence against Devon. A sharp intake of breath from Tiana. But you didn't, did you? I mean, what happened? It was real. Devon and I know, Gabrielle cut her off, not wanting to hear the details again. But I may have embellished some things, the financial records, for instance. And now they can't find you or your mother, and they think I might have had something to do with your disappearance. Oh God, Tiana's voice was small, frightened. What do you want me to do? Gabrielle gripped the phone tighter. I need you to come back, Tiana, to tell the truth about what happened between you and Devon. If you do that, maybe we can. But Gabrielle never got to finish her sentence. There was a sudden commotion on Tiana's end of the line, raised voices, the sound of a door slamming. I have to go, Tiana said hurriedly. I'm sorry, Mrs. Jackson. I can't help you. The line went dead, leaving Gabrielle listening to the hollow sound of the dial tone. She slowly lowered the phone, a sense of dread settling over her like a shroud. Outside, the light dusting of snow had given way to a cold, driving rain. Gabrielle watched as it lashed against the windows, distorting the view of the street beyond. In that moment, she felt more alone than she ever had in her life. The next morning dawned gray and dreary, matching Gabrielle's mood as she prepared for another day of uncertainty. She was halfway through her first cup of coffee when a sharp knock at the door made her jump. Her heart racing, she made her way to the front of the house. Through the frosted glass of the door, she could make out the outline of two figures. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door. Detective Okafor stood on her porch, accompanied by another officer Gabrielle didn't recognize. The detective's face was grim, her eyes hard. Gabrielle Jackson, she said, her voice carrying the weight of official authority. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and filing a false police report. Gabrielle felt the world tilt around her. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not like this. You have the right to remain silent, Detective Okafor continued, reaching for her handcuffs. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. As the detective recited the Miranda rights, Gabrielle's mind raced. How did it come to this? She had only wanted justice, wanted Devon to pay for his betrayal. How had her quest for vengeance turned into this nightmare? The cold metal of the handcuffs snapped around her wrists, jolting her back to reality. As Detective Okafor led her to the waiting police car, Gabrielle caught sight of her neighbors peeking out from behind curtains, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and something that looked unsettlingly like satisfaction. The car door slammed shut behind her, and as they pulled away from the curb, Gabrielle watched her house, the symbol of everything she had worked for, everything she had lost, recede in the rearview mirror. In that moment, the full weight of her actions came crashing down upon her. She had set out to destroy Devon, to make him pay for his betrayal. But in the end, she had destroyed herself. Her reputation, her family, her future, all of it lay in ruins. As the police car wound its way through the rain-slicked streets of Oakwood, Gabrielle closed her eyes, a single tear sliding down her cheek. The storm she had unleashed had come full circle, sweeping her up in its destructive path. And somewhere out there, Tiana Williams was still running, still hiding, carrying the weight of a secret that could destroy them all. The true crime story of Oakwood was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. The Los Angeles County Courthouse stood imposing against the bright blue California sky, its neoclassical facade a stark contrast to the modern skyscrapers surrounding it. On this sweltering July morning, the building was abuzz with activity, reporters and curious onlookers jostling for position on the courthouse steps. Inside, in a wood-paneled courtroom on the third floor, Gabrielle Jackson sat rigid in her chair, her once impeccable appearance now a shadow of its former self. The months since her arrest had taken their toll. Her hair, once glossy and perfectly styled, hung limp around her face, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. Beside her, her attorney, a sharp-featured woman named Vivian Chen, shuffled through a stack of papers, her lips pressed into a thin line of concentration. On the other side of the aisle, the prosecution team sat in a quiet conference, occasionally casting glances in Gabrielle's direction. As the bailiff called the court to order, a hush fell over the room. Judge Elijah Hawkins, a stern-faced man with salt and pepper hair, entered and took his seat at the bench. "The state of California versus Gabrielle Jackson," he intoned, his voice carrying easily through the packed courtroom. "Are both sides ready to proceed?" The lead prosecutor, a young, ambitious woman named Sarah Nguyen, stood. "The state is ready, Your Honor." Vivian Chen rose next. "The defense is ready, Your Honor." Judge Hawkins nodded. "Very well. Miss Nguyen, you may present your opening statement." Sarah Nguyen approached the jury box, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and confident, "this case is about betrayal. Not just the betrayal of a husband by his wife, but the betrayal of an entire community's trust." She paced slowly in front of the jury, making eye contact with each member. "The evidence will show that Gabrielle Jackson, driven by jealousy and a thirst for revenge, orchestrated an elaborate scheme to destroy her husband's life. She manipulated evidence, coerced a minor, and lied to law enforcement, all in pursuit of her own selfish agenda." Gabrielle felt her face flush with anger at the prosecutor's words, but she kept her expression neutral, just as Vivian had coached her. "But this case is about more than just one woman's actions," Nguyen continued. "It's about the ripple effects of those actions. The lives torn apart, the community left in shambles. By the end of this trial, you will see that Gabrielle Jackson's quest for vengeance was nothing short of a criminal act, and you will have no choice but to find her guilty on all counts." As Nguyen returned to her seat, Gabrielle felt a cold knot of fear form in her stomach. She had known this wouldn't be easy, but hearing the charges laid out so starkly made the gravity of her situation hit home. Vivian Chen stood next, smoothing her skirt as she approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice softer than Nguyen's but no less intense. "My colleague from the prosecution has painted a picture of my client as a calculating, vengeful woman. But I ask you to look beyond that simplistic portrayal." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The evidence will show that Gabrielle Jackson was a woman pushed to the brink. A woman who discovered her husband, a man she had loved and trusted for years, was engaged in a sexual relationship with a minor. A woman who, in her desperation to protect not just herself but the young girl involved, made some regrettable choices." Gabrielle watched as the jurors' expressions shifted, some showing signs of sympathy, others remaining impassive. "Yes, Gabrielle Jackson took actions that were, in the eyes of the law, wrong," Chen continued. "But I ask you to consider the circumstances that led to those actions, to consider what you might have done in her position. By the end of this trial, you will see that while Gabrielle may have made mistakes, her actions were those of a desperate woman trying to right a terrible wrong, not a criminal mastermind." As Chen returned to her seat, Gabrielle felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the jury would understand. But as the first witness was called, Detective Amara Okafor, Gabrielle knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The next few weeks would determine not just her fate, but the fate of everyone involved in this tangled web of betrayal and revenge. But it was on a sweltering Wednesday afternoon that the trial took an unexpected turn. Sarah Nguyen, the prosecutor, called her star witness to the stand. "The state calls Tiana Williams," she announced, her voice ringing through the hushed courtroom. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery as Tiana made her way to the witness stand. Gabrielle felt her heart racing as she watched the young woman now, take her seat. Tiana looked different from the last time Gabrielle had seen her. The girlish softness was gone from her face, replaced by a haunted, wary expression that spoke volumes about the toll the past year had taken. As Tiana was sworn in, Gabrielle caught her eye for a brief moment. There was something there, a flicker of, what, guilt? Resolve? Gabrielle couldn't be sure. Sarah Nguyen approached the witness stand, her demeanor gentler than it had been with previous witnesses. "Miss Williams," she began, Can you please tell the court about your relationship with Devin Jackson? Tiana took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. It started when I was 15, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Coach Jackson, Devin, he was always so nice to me. He made me feel special, you know? As Tiana recounted the details of her relationship with Devin, Gabrielle felt a mixture of emotions churning inside her. Anger at Devin for his betrayal, disgust at the manipulation of a child, and a growing sense of unease about where this testimony was heading. Miss Williams, Nguyen continued, did there come a time when Gabrielle Jackson confronted you about this relationship? Tiana nodded, her eyes flicking briefly to Gabrielle. Yes, she picked me up after school one day, told me she knew everything. And how did that make you feel? Scared, Tiana admitted. Ashamed, but also relieved, I guess, like maybe it could finally stop. Nguyen nodded sympathetically. What happened next, Tiana? Here, Tiana hesitated, and Gabrielle felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the moment that could make or break her case. Mrs. Jackson, Tiana began slowly, she told me that if I didn't go along with her plan, she'd make sure everyone knew what I'd done. That I'd be branded a homewrecker, that my life would be over before it even began. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Gabrielle felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. This wasn't what had happened. Not really. She had confronted Tiana, yes, but she had never threatened her. Had she? As Tiana continued her testimony, describing how Gabrielle had allegedly coerced her into exaggerating the extent of her relationship with Devin, into lying about the financial records, Gabrielle felt a sense of unreality descend upon her. Has she really done all of this? Had her desire for revenge twisted her memories, made her believe she was more innocent than she truly was? When it was Vivian Chen's turn to cross-examine Tiana, Gabrielle watched as her lawyer tried to poke holes in the young woman's story. But Tiana remained steadfast, her testimony unwavering even under Chen's skilled questioning. As Tiana was finally excused from the stand, her eyes met Gabrielle's once more. This time, there was no mistaking the emotion there. It was a mixture of sorrow and determination. At that moment, Gabrielle understood that Tiana had made a choice. Whether it was the truth or not, she had decided to paint Gabrielle as the villain of this story. The rest of the day passed in a blur for Gabrielle. More witnesses were called, more evidence presented, but she barely registered any of it. Her mind was stuck on Tiana's testimony, on the realization that her actions, whatever they truly had been, had irrevocably altered the course of that young girl's life. As the jury filed in, Gabrielle searched their faces for any hint of their decision, but their expressions remained impassive. Her heart pounded so loudly, she was sure everyone in the courtroom must be able to hear it. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Hawkins asked, his voice echoing in the hushed courtroom. The foreman, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, stood. We have, Your Honor. On the count of obstruction of justice, how do you find? We find the defendant, Gabrielle Jackson, guilty. Gabrielle felt her breath catch in her throat. She had known this was a possibility, had tried to prepare herself for it, but the reality was still a shock. On the count of tampering with evidence, guilty. And on the count of filing a false police report? A pause, barely perceptible, but to Gabrielle it felt like an eternity. Guilty. The word fell like a hammer blow. Gabrielle heard a gasp from somewhere behind her. Her mother, perhaps, or one of the few friends who had stood by her throughout this ordeal. But she didn't turn around. She couldn't bear to see the disappointment, the shock on their faces. As Judge Hawkins thanked the jury for their service and set a date for sentencing, Gabrielle felt oddly detached from the proceedings. It was as if she were watching it all happen to someone else, some other woman who had let her desire for revenge consume her until there was nothing left but ashes. It wasn't until she felt Vivian's hand on her arm that she snapped back to reality. We'll appeal, her lawyer was saying, her voice low and urgent. This isn't over, Gabrielle. But as Gabrielle was led from the courtroom, handcuffs chafing her wrists, she knew that in many ways it was over. Her reputation was in tatters, her family torn apart. The life she had known, the person she had been, was gone forever. At that moment, Gabrielle realized that there were no true winners in this story. Everyone, herself, Devin, Tiana, their families, the entire community of Oakwood, had lost something.